Good evening, viewers. Super Eagle One here, and welcome back to another video. Today we shall be whispering you to sleep while I reenact my most recent chess match. I hope you enjoy. Please leave feedback, like, comment, and if you feel like it, subscribe. But before we start, I want you all to take a deep breath. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3. Hold for 2, 1, 2, and out, 1, 2, 3. Breathe in again, 1, 2, 3. Hold for 2, 1, 2, and out, 1, 2, 3. Once more, breathe in, 1, 2, 3. Hold for 2, 1, 2, and out, 1, 2, 3. Alright, welcome to the match. I played with the black pieces here, and my opponent played with the white pieces. The match began with my opponent playing his pawn to c4, and I responded with e5. The opening shows that both players are putting their pawns on central squares to attack the squares and defend the squares in the center. Center is important because it allows you to pivot pieces around to initiate your own attack or defense more efficiently. Next, my opponent played knight c3, and in return I played knight f6, developing our pieces. My opponent continued with knight f3, and I followed up with knight c6. So all the knights came out to play. My opponent then decided to play g3. This is called a fianchetto. It allows the bishop to come out into a defensive fortress, opening up for the castling. Very defensive. Meanwhile, I played bishop to c5, staring down this very weak f-pawn. Next came d3 and knight g4. Now I have two attackers on his f-pawn. But my opponent is quite smart and played e3, preventing any attack. And following this, I decided to castle my king to safety. The next move played was my opponent's bishop to g2, fianchettoing his bishop nice and safely, and now it protects his knight and looks down this long light squared diagonal. After this, I played bishop b4, staring down the line at his king. My opponent castles, and I decide to take first blood and capture his knight on c3. In response, my opponent captures back with his b-pawn, and this is called doubling up the pawns, so both pawns are stuck behind each other. Following this, I decided to play b6 to put my own bishop on this long white diagonal. The next move was h3, kicking away my knight. which it did, back to f6. My opponent then decided to advance on the queen side with a4, gaining a lot of space. Bishop b7 was played. Now I'm looking back down at him on that light square diagonal. e4 was the next move to be played. Now he's blocked off the diagonal, defending his king so that this bishop's no longer as aggressive due to being protected, but also making his bishop less offensive. In response, I played d6. Next move to be played was knight d2. My opponent is beginning to reorganize and maneuver his pieces once more. And I did the same with knight d7, followed by knight b3 and knight c5. My opponent played bishop to e3. Now he has two attackers on my knight, but my knight isn't hanging around. I capture his knight first, before his queen captures my knight on the b3 square. The next move is knight a5, attacking his queen and reopening this diagonal. My opponent moves his queen to c2, and I advance my pawn to c5, gaining space and putting an extra defender on the d4 square. My opponent then decides to play f4. My response is knight to c6, putting my knight as a defender on the pawn. My opponent continues his advance to f5, and I halt it with f6. Queen d2 is played, lining up his bishops and queen on the dark squares. And in response, I play queen e7, making sure that my rooks are looking at each other to protect each other. King h2 is played, now allowing for his rooks to reach the g1 square so they can look at my king. Knight a5 is played once more by me, threatening this dangerous fork on his queen and rook. Queen f2 is played, taking his queen away from the danger. And bishop c6 is played, redeploying my knight and putting pressure on the a4 pawn. Bishop f3 is played. And knight b7 redeploys my knight. Next comes queen g2, staring down that line at my king. Knight d8 is played by me, as I once more move my knight across the board to defend against the threats on my king side. g4 is played. The advance begins. And knight f7 is played, protecting the g5 square. h4 is played now. The advance continues on. And I play king h8, getting out of that dangerous g-file. Rook g1 is played, doubling up on that ever so dangerous g-file. And rook g8 is played, adding my own defender to the g-file. a5 is played by white, attacking on both sides of the board. I decide to play b5, and my opponent snatches up my pawn. And in return, I snatch it back. c4 is played, pushing my bishop away. And I return it to its original square. King h3 is played. And now rook b8 is played, taking control of the b-file. Something that is not too comfortable. So my opponent decides to play rook b1. I decide to play a6, and my opponent plays rook to b6, protected by his pawn on the a file. I decide to capture, and my opponent captures in return, giving him a pass pawn. And I move my other rook across to protect the queening square and to threaten the pass pawn. In return, my opponent does the same. I move my queen across to d8, adding an extra attacker to the pawn. My opponent plays bishop d2 with a clever tactic where if I capture the pawn, he will move his bishop to a5 and attack both my rook and my queen on the same line. Have to be careful. So I simply ignore it with bishop b7, adding my own defender to the a pawn and preventing this b pawn from advancing. g5 is finally played, and the attack is launched. F takes g5, and H takes g5. Followed by bishop c8, looking down the line at his king. g6 is played, and I decide to capture. And in response, his queen recaptures. Ooh, he's getting dangerous now. Lots of pieces looking at my king with hungry eyes. So I decide to play rook b2, looking down this file so I can defend it in the future. Queen h5 check is played, and I move my king to safety. Rook g1 is played, once more staring down that dangerous g file, which is followed by king f8. Queen g6 is played once more, and I challenge it with queen f6, adding a defender to this pawn, and this pawn defending my queen. My opponent declines to exchange, and I capture his b-pawn. Rook g6 is played, attempting to knock my queen off. But now comes a most excellent move. Can you all see it? Yes, that's right. It's bishop takes g f5 check. What this does is my opponent cannot take my queen because he's in check, but it also attacks his rook and queen, so he must recapture the bishop. But doing so gives my queen an escape square and a free attack on all his pieces. So my opponent is forced to retake, and I retake with check. King g3 is played, and I play rook to b1, attacking him from all the way behind him. He plays queen takes g7, check, and I play king to e7. Bishop to e3 is played, protecting this square, where I would get a nice check, and eyeing down this g file, which is now dangerous for me. And in response, I play rook to f1, attacking his bishop. Bishop e4 is played in an attempt to attack my queen. I play queen h5, he plays queen h6, trying to capture my queen, and I play queen to e2. My opponent continues his attack with bishop to g5, check, and I play king to d7. My opponent is running out of checks and decides to take drastic measures. Otherwise, he will have to face my dangerous counterattack. He plays rook takes d6, check, and I recapture with my king. Now he is able to renew his attack. Queen f8 is played, followed by king c7. Then queen e7 is played, followed by king b6. Plays queen b7 check, protected by his bishop, and I play king a5 to escape. This is followed by queen c7 check and king b4. Queen b6 is played, check again, and king c3 is played. Finally, my opponent stops checking me and takes the pawn on c5. Queen e1 check is played, followed by king g2, followed by queen e2 once more, and king g3 is played, wherein I decide to capture his bishop on g5. Queen a3 check is played, and king d4 is played, followed by queen d6 check, and king e3 to escape. Queen c5 is played, check again, and king d2 is played. Queen b4 check, followed by king c1. Queen c3 check. Now this time I block with my queen. And so queen a1 check. I can't move my king, otherwise he captures my rook. So I must block with my queen. Queen takes e5. My knight captures his bishop with check, and queen takes e4. I decide to play king d2 to prevent the disconnect from my queen and rook. And queen g2 check is played, to which I capture the d-pawn. Queen d5 check is played, and king e2 is played. Queen h5 is played, and king d2 is played. Queen g5 is played, check, and king c3 is played. followed by queen e5 check, and I capture his last remaining pawn. Queen e6 is played, check, and king b5 is played. Queen d5 is played, desperation growing as it becomes more obvious, but I have winning material. But calmly, queen b6 is played. Queen d4 check, but king b7. King g2 is played, and rook c1 is played. Queen d5 check is played, and king a7 is played. Queen d4 check is played, and king a8 is played. Queen d8 is played, and finally queen b8 is played to defend. He's run out of checks. Queen f6 is played, and now it's my turn. Rook c2 check, king f3, queen b3 check, king e4, rook c4 check, king f5, and in this position, after I play queen to b5 check, my opponent resigns, with no hope of defending his queen or his king from the imminent checkmate. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and wishing you sleepy dreams.